All right, howdy. Good afternoon. My name is Keith Cole. I'm the Associate Director for Program Development at the Borlaug Institute. On behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you to our fourth Borlaug seminar of the fall semester. Normally, Dr. Elsa Morano, the director, would do the welcome, but she and other colleagues are participating in the annual World Food Prize events, which are going on this week in Des Moines, Iowa. And if you're not, in fact, today is actually World Food Day, if you're not aware of that. The World Food Prize was established by Dr. Borlaug in 1986, so it's only fitting that our director and colleagues are there representing the Institute. Today's discussion is on climate change and food security. As everyone probably knows, climate change and climate variation have become topics of increasing importance in the last several years. It's entered into our national and international discussions at multiple levels, be it in public discourse, in U.S. party political debate, questions of national security, overall environmental concerns, and the future of global food security itself. So I'd like to give a couple of examples to set the stage before I turn it over to our speakers. In terms of public discourse, I found a Gallup poll from April 22nd of this year that reads, quote, "Over the past decade, Americans have clustered into three broad groups on global warming. The largest, currently describing 39% of U.S. adults, are what can be termed as concerned believers," that's their term. In other words, those who attribute global warming to human actions and are worried about it. This is followed by the mixed middle at 36%, and then 1 in 4 Americans, or the cool skeptics, again their term, are not worried about global warming much or at all. Within our national political party debate, there was a May 7th article in the New York Times that began by stating Americans are less worried about climate change than the residents of any other high-income country, and then goes on to provide statistics showing that 25% of one party believe it to be a, quote, major threat, which places it between the country of Egypt and that of China as a whole in their belief about it, while 65% of the other party believe it to be a major threat. In the realm of national security, in 2008, Congress mandated that the then upcoming 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, and that's the policy document that lays out the guiding principles of U.S. military strategy and doctrine, consider the national security impacts of climate change. In fact, just Tuesday of this week, U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel stated at a Pentagon press briefing that the U.S. military considers climate change to be a, quote, threat multiplier. That Pentagon report continued, stating, "The impacts of climate change may cause instability in other countries by impairing access to food and water, damaging infrastructure, spreading disease, uprooting and displacing large numbers of people, compelling mass migration," and continues. For environmental concerns, you only have to pick up this month's issue of National Geographic that describes the impact in the Western United States. So now more to the specific topic at hand, which is climate change and food security. I'll just simply say that I looked in the chapter entitled Adapting to Climate Change. Gordon Conway, in his most recent book, 1 Billion Hungry, Can We Feed the World, cites one report stating, "One study that combines agronomic and economic modeling suggests a 6% reduction in global agricultural production by 2080. He then continues, "However, in hotter climates, such as parts of Africa, Asia, and Central America, areas in which the Borlaug Institute is primarily engaged, those losses may be even higher." Now, Sir Gordon does provide the caveat that these estimates are for production potential and take no account of technology advances, the impact of adaptation, mitigation, changes in market prices for food, and the complex feedbacks between agro-ecosystems and the economy. So to help us better understand these issues, I am pleased to introduce our two panelists, Dr. Bruce McCarl and Dr. Rabi Mohtar. Each will speak for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, with the balance left for questions. Dr. McCarl will go first. He is a University Distinguished Professor of Agricultural Economics here at Texas A&M. His work areas include water economics, climate change, agricultural policy, managerial economics, and quantitative analysis. Dr. McCarl has worked on water evaluation and allocation issues for 35 years and climate change issues for 25 years. He is a fellow of 3 agricultural economic societies, a former member of the America's Climate Choices Study, and has twice been lead author on reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I think most of you know collectively won the Nobel Prize in 2007. Following Dr. McCarl will be Dr. Rabi Mohtar, who is the holder of the Tees Endowed Professorship at Texas A&M. He is also the founding executive director of the Qatar Environment and Energy Research Institute. His research is focused on conserving natural resources that face global challenges, such as increasing food and water supplies for a growing population. Dr. Mohtar was a pioneer in developing a conceptual and modeling framework for the water, energy, food nexus and linking science to policy. He has served on the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Water Security and on the Board of Governors. Oops, that's my little timer to cut me off. And on the Board of Governors of the World Water Council. So that was very good timing. I am stopping there and would like to turn it over to Dr. McCarl.
Well, Rabi told me that he was going to talk more about water and less about climate change, which means I'm the only one that's going to talk a lot about climate change. And it's a pretty big story, 25 years of work. I could probably keep you here for a week or two if you wanted to stay that long. But I'm going to fly through a few slides to take a look at some of the issues. And then I'm going to get to what I think are issues facing a group like the Borlaug Institute. So the first thing is just the climate history. You can see here from this that we've had a rather steady uptick in how warm it's been. We're about a degree warmer than what it was back at the beginning of the 1900s. I guess that's the 20th century. 13 of the 14 warmest years we've ever seen and recorded temperature on have occurred since the year 2000. So when you hear some people say climate change has stopped, what they're referring to is this little flat section up here, but look at where it is compared to what's back here. Also, this is somewhat controversial. There are people arguing over whether the ocean is appropriately counted and the Antarctic is appropriately counted. And when some people say this keeps going when you do that right, I'm not the one to engage in that argument, so I won't talk about it. There are some rather major things that have happened. This is what I think is one of the scary ones, which is up until 1980 or so, we were bouncing around with about 15% of the world's agricultural lands under drought during any year. Since then, we've risen up somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 to 30%. So twice as much land under drought on average as there was back in the earlier periods. And notice a lot of the places that drought is happening are somewhat close to here and in important developing areas of the country, of the world, particularly in Asia and Africa, a little bit in Latin America. This is from the IPC, what they call the SREX report, Special Report on Extreme Events. It shows comparisons in terms of what's happening to costly disasters around the world. I notice we're seeing an increase in the frequency and the cost. Here, there's not a real strong statistical signal here, obviously, but in the later time periods, we're certainly seeing more disasters than we were in the early time periods. And there's an argument in some areas that we're seeing more tropical storms in Asia in particular, and we're seeing more droughts that are costly. Now, why are we seeing this kind of thing? Well, over the time, the IPC has evolved to the point now it says that there's 95 to 100% probability that human activities are causing more than half of these changes. This is really a greenhouse gas story. Atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations is what they're talking about as the human cause. And you can see that back when I started doing work on climate change and nobody believed, everybody thought I was crazy. This was 345 parts per million. Yesterday, when I changed these slides, I had some numbers of 399 from earlier this spring. I tried to change it and made it 3,979. That's really supposed to be 397, which is the number from up here. But you can see a very steady progression of a couple of parts per million every year. Somebody once told me this would be a lake of carbon dioxide the size of the Gulf of Mexico that we've put into the atmosphere in the last 25 years. You can also see that increase sitting over here relative to a longer time period. You know, back in pre-industrial times, we were 275 parts per million. Now we're creeping up towards 400. But when you consider methane, nitrous oxide, and a bunch of other things, we're somewhere close to 450 parts per million right now. That led Europe to drop its goal. It had a goal saying we're going to stop it before it got to 450 parts per million. They're pretty much looking at that in the rear view mirror now, and then they no longer want a goal that's behind them. You can also see the correlation between carbon dioxide concentrations and temperature. Now, when we get to what is projected, this is what we've seen so far. We've seen this 1 degree of warming. We're up sitting right about here right now. This is the projections of what else we could see. So we could see 4 times as much, and that means quite a bit more disruption compared to what we've seen so far. The projections are for river flows that we're going to have a lot of areas of the world, and again, areas that are important in the development arena, particularly in Asia here, that we expect to have quite a bit less river flows and large areas where we expect quite a lot less soil moisture. So these are going to be places like Northeast Brazil where non-irrigated farming is going to become significantly less viable, and other areas of the world face that issue. Sea level rise is another projected item. This is a picture of Bangladesh with and without sea level rise, and this is very important rice producing area, and you can notice it becomes very important shrimp producing area in this particular study. I don't know if it's shrimp or not, but it's something. My mother's property in Miami may be looking forward to being ocean bottom view property. Here are the sea level numbers. They range by 2100 or so from 1/4 of a meter, so roughly a foot, to 0.8 of a meter, roughly 2.5 feet or so, are the estimates for out here in the future. And this depends very much on the greenhouse gas emissions future. A number of other things that will affect agriculture, given I don't know how much time I have and I don't want to use it all before I get to the meat. You can see there's a bunch of things here that could happen. Small, unimportant events like no more Gulf Stream, or heat waves that are more intense, more droughts, longer periods between rainfall events. Agriculturally, we expect plant water demand to go up. That means irrigation requirements go up, as well as requirements for moisture from rainfall. Globally, we expect more rainfall because if it's hotter, we have more evaporation, but the issue is a distribution of that rainfall. with areas in the subtropics expected to get less, and that means a band like Texas and into Egypt and Pakistan and some of China and areas in South America like, well, I guess it wouldn't quite be northeast Brazil because that's right on the equator. Greater water competition, more water needs from the city, less fresh surface water in places. I mean, we're going to have bigger evaporation rates, but in some places we're going to have more rainfall. I think in the Red River Valley of Minnesota, they've had 500-year floods in the last decade, so they may be getting a little bit more. More water and infrequent events, more pests, less grass. Northward crop migrations, we're seeing a lot more crops now in North Dakota than we used to, a lot more corn, and various other types of effects. Now, this is out of the brand new IPCC report from 2014, and I must admit that I recommend you take several very large grains of salt with this statement. But they say, based on many studies covering a wide range of regions and crops, negative impacts of climate change on crop yield have been more common than positive ones. And they basically in here somewhere say about a 6% reduction somewhere in the report. They also say things like this: since AR4, several periods of rapid food price increases have followed key climate extremes. I just got a paper where somebody did statistical analysis on that, and their conclusion is baloney in big words about yay big. I'm having it reviewed now for climatic change. I don't know if there's people in the room that are looking at it. Is Bessler here? No. But anyhow, not all this is necessarily something I agree with. I wasn't on that chapter. I wrote nasty comments about it, but they ignored them all. Here's what I think they're talking about, though. If you look in the United States at corn yields over time, we had a very nice exponential rise up into the mid-70s at about 2.7% per year. Since the mid-70s, we've had a slowdown with about a 1.7% rise. If that continues, things like bioenergy and protecting the rainforest may be very difficult to maintain, because if we're not getting as much technological progress, and if population starts growing at a rate faster than that technological progress, we're in trouble. We did some statistical analysis on this, and we're finding climate is part of this explanation. I had somebody attack me the other day and say, yeah, but we're also getting to the point we just can't develop corn any further. That's been an argument that's been around since the early 70s. It was called the Club of Rome back then. Who knows? But you guys should know better than I am. There are probably some plant breeders here. But the real issue is climate drawing down our ability to have this technical progress. Now, we did some work in Mali and a couple other countries, and since you had food security in the title, I thought I'd bring one food security slide. Here, under base conditions, about a third of the population in Mali is under risk of food insecurity. Under two different climate change projections, without any adaptation, we rise up to the 70% level in food insecurity in that country. This is a country that I think would really have difficulty adapting to warmer conditions. Here in the US, we have as many acres that are cold limited as we do heat limited, and we benefit in the cold limited areas and lose in little places like Texas that are in the heat limited areas. But we can move the production systems north. In Mali, there's this small thing called the Sahara Desert that's hard to move north into. And I'll talk a little bit more, but with some adaptation in crop varieties and different production practices, we can cut this risk about in half. But it's things like the Borlaug Institute that need to develop the varieties to get down back into this range. In the face of climate change, there's three things we can do. We can live with it. And that's been a lot of the U.S.'s strategy for the past 20 years. And under those circumstances, we have maybe larger impacts. We spend research time monitoring what's going on, what's happening to yields, how are people adapting, what's happening to the climate, et cetera. That's where we've spent the bulk of our climate change money to date. We can also try to reduce the drivers, so lower atmospheric CO2. The more we spend on that, as we spend more money on that, we get to less impacts, according to the whole theory. We can also adapt. And what that means is spending money, taking our existing cropping systems and make them so they perform better under hotter conditions. So we're going to operate somewhere in the middle of this. We're actually already operating somewhere in the middle because we're spending money on breeding and we are spending at least some money on mitigation. But this is going to be difficult because what's happened here in these emissions is there's been huge growth, not in the United States, not in the OECD countries, but basically it's been in, I'm trying to look at the pictures somewhere here. This is the US, I know that. These colors are practically impossible to see or differentiate. I think this one's the Middle East and China's probably this one here. And I guess I must have cut a couple of legends off down at the bottom. But you can see the growth has almost all been in the developing countries, and that's a function of two things, population and income. And I don't think we think population and income are going to stop growing. I have a picture somewhere that shows emissions versus income, and guess what? The highest income countries are the highest emitting countries. This means there's a great inevitability to climate change. And in fact, these are different scenarios for greenhouse gases here. This is if we stop emitting right now. This is if we continue our business on the way we're doing it without any large mitigation things. Notice under any of these, they don't make much difference between now and 2040. What that basically says is we're going to have about a degree of warming no matter what we do on the mitigation side. So someplace like Borlaug has got to spend effort to say how in these places that are production challenged now can we continue the levels of production that they have under a 1 degree warmer temperature. Adaptation then is the big thing I think we can do in agriculture. We're not the biggest emitters. There are some things we can do about mitigation, but really we're much more on the adaptation side. We're in the back seat on the roller coaster along for the ride. So adaptations can be natural, autonomous, or planned. We're in the planned area. What can we do about providing information, shaping market conditions, developing technologies? What can we do about thinking about more water development, providing resources, carrying out projects? And then we may have to influence natural adaptation by managing the unmanaged. What I mean by that is just picture a little float up there by an iceberg for a polar bear to sit on with a float having oil barrels underneath and a nice wooden surface. I mean, are we going to do something like that, or move butterflies, or pick up sugar maple seeds and move them further north? We may have to do some of that stuff to manage adaptation. We've seen autonomous adaptation. The average acre of corn in the United States has moved north and west 100 acres since 1950. That's not all because of climate, but that's one of the things that happen. In the state of Texas, as it gets warmer, more cropland switches out into pasture. As it's gotten warmer, we've had lower stocking rates. These are autonomous adaptations done by the farmers. We don't need to tell them how to do it. They're going to do it on their own. But not very many farmers are going to create a new crop variety that say he uses 1 acre-foot of water in the high plains rather than 3. So when we get to what Borlaug could do, R&D on heat-tolerant crops, low water-using crops, pest and disease-resistant, heat-tolerant livestock breeds, invasive species management, help with risk management for farmers, disseminate information, advise in infrastructure investment, what kind of water control, where should processing be, managing unmanaged items, figuring out what to do, and look at non-ag water conservation and land conservation. Then on the effects monitoring, what are the threats currently and what's projected? What are observed adaptations, what the natural ones and autonomous ones? What are our adaptation alternatives and responses? Assess those things and identify limits and hopefully strategies around them. And then finally, we can bring in mitigation. I think there's some big emission threats out of land, like the permafrost, peat, and fires, that we need to identify how much of a threat these are and what we might be able to do about them, identify cheap mitigation possibilities. The big one in developing countries is how can we grow income and population without growing emissions a lot? And then ways to maintain and grow food production without a heck of a lot more emissions while protecting the environment, and incentive design to get people to do that. So I probably went well over my 15 minutes, but where's Keith in the back? I'm fine. How in the hell could I be fine? Excuse me. So Rabi, it's all yours. Do I know how to get into his project? Yeah, there you go.
Thank you, Bruce. Actually, I couldn't think of a better duo to do this than having the external driver to all of water and food security than this. So thank you, Keith, for this combination. What I'll be talking about is picking up from where Bruce left in terms of the shortages of water and food security, and share with you some platforms in which I believe are essential, that has been somewhere lost. I won't dwell on these challenges, but I'd like to just pose in the problem, which is, if I'm in engineering, I'm an engineer, so I would like to pose it from an engineering problem. And it's what we call an ill-posed problem, which is a problem that doesn't have solution. You have 40% new water. And by the way, highlighted this in Carlos, that you could remember, the global trend on water insecurity parallels what we are facing here in Texas. Absolutely. So there's a 40% gap by 2030 in Texas, mirrors that the global picture. So we've got 40% gap in water. A lot of it is coming from the shifts that Bruce talked about. And more importantly, which I will be focusing on for the most of the presentation, is about the soil water. That's a very important element of what I'll be talking about. Now, if you, on top of that, think of the 40% additional energy requirement. Now, we all know, we don't think much about it, but our food production is an energy intensive, and water transport and mobility is an energy intensive process. And we don't have the infrastructure for that. And this is not the focus of the talk, but I just want to make sure to highlight it. Now, Keith at the beginning says 60%. The data, I'm being very, very conservative, saying 50% additional food. A lot of the literature, the last report, Feed the Future, that went out of Washington, the White House says 75%. Anyway, the bottom line is at least 50% of additional food. And as Bruce mentioned, we will have less water available, but on top of it, irrigation. A lot of the areas that traditionally today rain-fed will have to move into irrigated agriculture. So that's the ill-posed problem that I'd like to mention. And item number 4, you've seen a lot of the data that supports this lack of water in general, 10 to 20 to 30%, but that's something that I think I'll skip. this is the kind of an entry to what I'm going to be talking about. So Bruce mentioned a lot about adaptation. I'm going to bring in a term, resilience, because it is about resilience. It's about building resilience. And one thing that I'm a hydrologist, so my background is hydrology. And if you know anything about hydrology, you know that most of us look into the past and predict the future. We are now, the carpet underneath us has been pulled out, and we are in a non-stationary world. So we're really at the transition zone in our establishing science for the future in hydrology, because we cannot use the past to predict the future. And I think this is a very much a fundamental concept that science have to come to grasp with, and that's increasing risk, not only on the farmers, not only in the community, but also us as a community of science. We need to be adaptive to this non-stationarity and develop science that deals with more risk. So the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk about one side of the nexus. So the nexus that we've been working on, water, energy, food. I'm going to focus on the food, water side of the nexus, and that's a nexus by itself. And I'm going to mention few words, maybe most of you in this room are familiar with, but I'm just going to enforce those. And I'm going to talk about green water. I think it's time for us to really reassess and start revisiting some of the concepts that has been in existence in our soil physics and our soil understanding for centuries. So what is green water? Some statistics about it. It is a smallest portion of the freshwater resource we have. It only constitutes about 0.05% of the total freshwater on Earth, which is a very, very tiny amount of water. However, it is about 60% of the food we eat comes from that portion. So 60% of the food supply comes from rain-fed agriculture. It's not coming from irrigated agriculture. The consumptive water use of the food we eat, 87% of it is coming from green water. And again, if you focus on the cereal, about 60% of the cereal we eat is coming from that green water. And yet, and I say big, bold, underline that I'm a soil physicist, I'm a hydrologist, so I'm being self-critical here. And yet, we don't pay much attention to this resource. And I'm gonna dwell a little bit more here. This is an analysis that we conducted. It's a rough analysis that we did for North Africa. And the alarming features that I'd like you to see here. This is rainfall, and this is what I call green water flow. This is all the subsurface storage, groundwater recharge, flow, interbasin flow, you name it. This is we don't see that. That's the flow in between, and that's not something that we can use for food production. I'd like you to focus on these two bars. The blue one is what we call the blue water. That's the groundwater. That's the groundwater that we pump. That's the surface water. And please look at these numbers here. On average, we have more water stored in the Vado zone than what we have blue water. And yet we fight over blue water. We have policies, we have treaties, and we have a lot of our effort goes into how do you partition this? And yet the green water, which is a resource that has been the foundation for our dryland agriculture, in many, many ways have ignored. I'm going to show you only a couple of these examples that illustrate what I'm talking about. These are two images that has been pretty much, they represented, I mean, I'm going to go a little bit maybe beyond some of the comfort limit of the non-soil physicists in the room. But the representative elementary volume has been with us for the last 60, 70 years that represent the conceptualization of what we consider, what I call here, the soil physics and the modeling part with the pedology. And there's a disconnect between what we observe in the soil processes and what we model. And what I'm proposing here, we need a better integration of the pedology with hydrology. And that's what really is an emerging field of hydropedology. And to be more exact, hydrostructure pedology. What this allows us to do is to really, I'm going to give you a simple example. Taking Mali as an example, and you want to really have a certain practice on the ground. Is it doing what it's supposed to do at the larger scale? A farmer level practice, minimum tillage or any other practice, what's the impact of this locally on a farm, on a large country scale? I can tell you with certainty, we don't know. I can tell you with certainty that many of the soil interfaces we do is not translated into a scalable up and down from policy all the way down to the local. And the reason is because of this disconnect. I'll tell you a little bit even more. And I'm gonna revisit this in a while. When you talk about the impact of soil, soil is a living entity. It swells and shrinks. It's a living medium. We don't know the projection, the 2%, I mean, call it 1%, 2% temperature change, the impact on soil structure. We don't know because the models we built our understanding for soil physics is based on mathematical formulation rather than on physical formulation. And that's what, so anyway, we need a better ways to represent the soil characterization of the soil medium. And more importantly, we need a scalable models where the foundation of hydrologic models can be based on structural properties, natural organization of the soil, rather than an arbitrary grid of a GIS model that comes in with a arbitrary delineation of these sub-watersheds. So I'm going to spend most of my time on this slide. In fact, my earlier presentation was one slide, was this slide. So here's what I'm going to focus on. We have 40% water gap, and we have all of these challenges that surrounds the water and food security. We all know, everybody in this room knows implicitly, conceptually, that water and food are interlinked. I'm not going to argue that. So here's the model that I'd like us to work on, and that's simplified in a nexus, is a nexus between local and trade. How do we adapt? How do we develop resilience? How do we localize water and food security? So I'm looking at the 40% water gap by 2030. And these are the portfolio. I'm the technical assistant to the Minister of Agriculture in Mali. And the minister comes to me, we need help. I look at the 40% water gap, and these are the portfolio that's available for me. Conservation, I call it conservation, but it's really conservation efficiency. That's where the irrigation technology comes in. That's where the breeding comes in. That's all the science that around policy, genetics. That plays a role in bridging that gap. There's a lot of waste that we have. Trade, certainly. Go to a country like Jordan, 90 to 95% of its water is imported through food trade. That's very important. I'm not going to talk about this for a simple reason. This is outside academia. This is the private sector. This is where the private sector comes in, mobilize food. They have done it for centuries, and they know how to do it at a very small margin of profit. They know how to do it. They have a precision. They have a machine that they could do it. They have the machines that surrounds the production, the transport. That's the supply chain. It's outside the academic world. I think it's there, and in many ways, it has contributed to peace. Somebody, Keith, mentioned Egypt. Egypt, Sadat, in one of his last speeches, said, I will not go to war anymore. He paused for a few seconds and said, unless our water resources is threatened. Now, why Egypt has not gone into war? Have you thought about it with Ethiopia? Because of trade. So trade is important, but let's not talk about it. In time management, I learned a big lesson. You put in your big blocks first, and then you start fitting everything else around it. As the assistant to the technical assistant to the Minister of Food, that's not my big block. My big block is how do I localize food and water security. So I'm going to start up into what I call, for us in Texas, it's a huge issue. And that includes the produced water, that includes the wastewater, the gray water, the brackish water, you name it. That's all under one big umbrella that I call new water. There's a problem with this. Long term, I don't know the impact on soil quality, which is very important. I don't know the impact on health, human health. That's a research question that we need to address. This is a huge impact on how we develop the potential. is to look into the science of looking at what are the impact of this new water into my whole ecosystem. And the biggest chunk that I'd like to focus on is the green water. And I would argue, we looked into the literature, there are 5 definitions of green water. So even the science community has not agreed what does green water mean. Is it consumptive use? Does it include evapotranspiration? Does it include evaporation and transpiration? Does it include all of the interflow between pedons? We don't have a clear definition of that. So the first thing I'm arguing, we need a better accounting. I need to know how much of that resource I have. That's the first thing. Second, I need to map it geographically. So I know where are my sources and where are my sinks. So the geographic mapping and the management of this at the spatial scale is extremely important. Last but not least is a multi-scale model, which I mentioned earlier. Today, I don't have a transfer across scale conceptual framework to allow me to connect local practices all the way to the policy scale. People say we have it, and I argue we don't have it, because we don't have a solid understanding of the soil structure. If I'm looking at the GIS map, and in a click of a button, I have a grid that says, this is my computational unit, I do the hydrology. Sorry, that does not constitute a structure that soil doesn't know this, that it's like the political boundaries between countries. Soil watersheds do not see this grid line that I have imposed, or doesn't know the differential equations that I'm imposing on these processes. So, in a nutshell, we do have resources, local resources. Then I'm going to bring back this nexus. What is the nexus? How much I can produce locally without infringing on the environment, without infringing on the energy, the water, the other resources, and how much I bring with trade? I think this is a very legitimate question that every single country should have, based on facts, not based on other. So to do this trade and to do this nexus, we need a holistic system level view on the trade-off. And that brings me to the platform that we've been working on, which is a platform that connects the water, energy, food resources in a holistic way, that quantifies the interlinkages, defines them and quantifies them, develop hotspots. And I think this is a key word, developing hotspots. There are no magic bullets. This analysis gives me areas in which I should invest. Should I invest in farm practices, training for farmers for a better practice, or should I invest in irrigation technology, drip irrigation that uses less water? That's where really the interlinkages and trade-offs allow me to do. This is the platform that allows for all this to happen. I guess my time is almost up, and I'd like to introduce to you some platform that we've been working with, but maybe there's no time for that, because I'd like to conclude. 4 points I'd like you to leave with. First, we need a holistic platform that quantifies the interlinkages, that define a trade-off for future. And again, there are no win-win situations. There are trade-offs. Second, we need to study feasibility and potential and impact of new water, all that water that we must use and reuse to bridge that water and food gap. Third, we need a better accounting for the green water as a resource. Last but not least, which is ignored, is the connecting properties to behavior in the soil. Without this last piece, there's no way I know of that we can connect local practices with policy. Thank you. Acknowledge the team.